13 years I had this disease for such a long time that I had built up this picture in my head that this was what the rest of my life looked like. Back in 2008 or 9, I was just going to a routine physical, and my GP heard some crackling in my breathing, with the stethoscope, and assumed that I had pneumonia, and that was sort of the beginning of this journey. Went to X-ray and saw a spot on the X-ray, and then things just progressed from there. I think it was about 2 years later that they gave me the diagnosis of pulmonary fibrosis. And so I lived with it without too much impact for a few years, a handful of years. And then around 2018, it started to really drop off to a point where I needed oxygen. I still got out as much as I could, but the heavy exertion stuff, I really needed to be inside and hooked up to an oxygen concentrator. And then at the end of 21, I could just tell that I was starting to cross the threshold. And so when I went back in August, or when I was referred back in August of 2022, it was my second time. But they moved very quickly. They saw the urgency and got me listed, and 10 days later they found me lungs, and I had a double lung transplant on November 30th, 2022. There was a day where all of a sudden it just struck me. I was like, holy cow, I've got a whole life I can start planning now. Every trip we took, everything we did was always built around me and navigating the disease and its effects, that now all of a sudden it struck me that we were unencumbered by all that, and it was really, that was probably the most jarring thing, was when I had that revelation. Someone came into my room and said, have you ever heard of the transplant games? And I was like, no. They're like, we need you on the transplant games. As the team would make their rounds, I'd have a different team in my room almost every day, and it seemed like they kept bringing it up. And I was like, sure, count me in. It sounds like fun. It took a long time to recover from this. And I knew it would. About a year into this, I still wasn't where I thought I'd be, or I'd hoped to be. And that was, I would say, that was the point where the transplant games became a motivator for me. So we're all there having fun, running track and playing pickleball and all the things that we do. But I don't think anyone there lost sight of why we're really there. And that was really neat for me to experience. I think that was the thing that I wasn't expecting. It was my first games, and I'd never been around so many transplants before. And just seeing them all out there living their lives, it was pretty neat. But I think the biggest part was the community. I've been an organ donor, my whole life. Now being a recipient of this, and really truly, I think, understanding the impact of it, it's pretty profound. The impact, the fact that I get to go on, where otherwise I would have died 2 years ago, is pretty amazing. Without this, the miracle that happened. Allowing my boys to grow up with continue on having a father and having a family intact, and all the impacts that brings is pretty remarkable.